everyone. Welcome. Tonight's alumni panel, I'm sure you all know, is on the topic of the role of social workers in school systems, grades K-12 through post-secondary education. And I am tonight's moderator. My name is Carrie McCarthy. I'm a brand new student in the 16-month accelerated program. And like all of you, I'm here to find out what our alumni have to say. So I'll let both of you introduce yourselves.
My name is Tracy Robin. I work at the new school, Assistant Vice President for Student Health and Support Services. Hi. Hello.
Ainsley Rudolfo, the New York City Department of Education. I'm the ED for Programs and Partnerships with the DOE.
Alright, so I guess the first question is what all of us are struggling with right now. Taking you back to when you were a student here, is did you know that you wanted to start working in the school system when you were a student here? Or did you plan ahead to try and work in the school system, and how did you come to the position you're in today? That's a big question.
Yeah, well for me it was purely accidental. Most of my experience prior to working at the new school was in hospital-based rape crisis programs, and where I got a range of really wonderful experience as a clinician, doing crisis intervention, short-term therapy, long-term therapy, running groups. And this is what I was doing, and I had a small private practice on the side. And a friend told me about an opportunity for a part-time therapist at the new school, and it sounded really kind of fun and different, and I was ready to make a change. And so I started working there as a counselor, part-time, and was really loving working with the students. And I think the reason that they actually hired me, because it's sort of difficult to get a job in a mental health clinic in a university. And I think the reason they hired me is because they were more and more seeing students with some serious problems and really needing someone who had a lot of background in crisis intervention. And so I think that's why I was appealing to the director at the time. And I started working there, and then, I don't know, one thing led to another, and I, became an administrator. So very unplanned, I would say.
Yes, I suppose since you came in a few minutes late, you introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Typhanie Jackson. I come from New Haven, Connecticut. Obviously, if you've seen the news, we've been swamped and swallowed by a ton of snow, so I'm very happy to be here with you today. I am the Director of Student Services for New Haven Public Schools, and really that means a mishmash of many different things. I did start out as both a clinical social worker and a school social worker. Worked a lot with children who've been adjudicated as juvenile delinquents. Currently working in a position where I really have a lot of influence on the way by which school social work practice is not implemented, but how it's looked upon and how we actually go about our business within the school day. It's a very exciting role, having been both a school social worker and now actually a director, having both special education and also having school social workers, school psychologists, guidance counselors, and a host of other folks. I think that one of the things that we do in Connecticut, New Haven, Connecticut is one of the largest urban districts in Connecticut, and one of the things that we look at as far as school social work is concerned is really not necessarily running a pseudo clinic within schools, but really how do you actually influence and impact the overall environment in schools. And one of the things I can tell you is that there's different schools of thought about that. There are some folks who believe that, again, we could be school social workers who are clinicians in the schools on one end, and then on the other end, really looking and being very, very progressive in the thinking and mindset of how do we impact the system. I don't know if that's too much at this point in time, because we can go on and as we go through our questions, but it's really an exciting time. School social work, I think, is a very eclectic approach to social work. I think there's a multitude of things that you can do. There's endless possibilities as a school social worker. I think that one of the things you have to be mindful of as a school social worker is that you work in a school. and being able to navigate that system and not siloing yourself as a social worker who's a clinician, but understanding you're also a social worker who can influence and impact more than just what's in your sphere of influence on a given caseload. So I think you have to look at it that way. The principals value that. They value folks who are going to roll up their sleeves and really impact systems, school systems, not necessarily just a clinical practice plopped inside of a school. So again, that's the reality of what we have in Connecticut.
Okay. The question I had proposed was, as a student, were you planning all along to work in the school system, or is this something that sort of fell into, or how did you develop your career and wind up where you are? Was it planned?
It really wasn't a plan. I came to NYU because I wanted to be a clinical social worker, and if you want to be a clinical social worker, you come to NYU. What ended up happening is, as I was doing, as I mentioned previously, I've worked a lot with adjudicated juvenile delinquents, and one of the gaps that I saw was that really, with education, there were a lot of children who had a lot of social, emotional, behavioral challenges, and really, what's my work enough to be able to influence that? So as I was doing that work, working in a residential facility, and then being able to have interact with the juvenile justice system, I much more so started to become involved in the schools, whether it was just in planning meetings, whether it was in what we call IEP or PPT meetings. From that led me to saying I want to be a school social worker and really impact and influence change. And really, like I said again, right now, even when I was a clinical social worker doing contractual work, I found that it was a lot more than just individual caseload. But how wonderful would it be for me being a school social worker to be able to influence a system and do a lot of work by way of prevention. So,
Ainsley, what brought you to the school system?
Well, I'm not even sure what brought me to the school system. I'm not even sure what brought me to social work. At the time, at least for my first year at NYU, I didn't even think I should be in the school of social work. I wasn't sure, you know, I knew I wanted to work with kids at that point, but I know I didn't want to do psychology, which I didn't want to sort of do psychology at the time. And, you know, I said, hey, well, let me look at social work. So I ended up in the school of social work. But then when I got here, I realized, this is an interesting place. I see it hasn't changed much. Still female, still mainly white, and NYU School of Social Work. But in terms of education, you know, a lot of what happened to me and got me to education happened basically by people that I knew and people that I met. You know, I started out in clinical social work at Staten Island Mental Health Society and was doing direct service there. And then realized that it's very boring after a while. You get the same kids who never showed up, and the same parents who have the same problems, and the same diagnosis. And you're like, oh my God, I'm spinning this over and over. Okay, this child is acting up. How many attention deficit kids could you see? And then after a while, you say, I said, okay, this is, I don't think I can do much of this. And then I met someone who said, hey, do you want to join City? And I started at ACS, actually, in child welfare. And while I was in child welfare, I did a lot of work in management and administrative work. And then 9/11 happened, and I was asked to join Department of Health Mental Hygiene around the efforts in Project Liberty, which was our response to 9/11 here in the city. And I did some work there. And my work at the time was supervising the efforts that were happening in the schools. So FEMA gave us in the city a lot of money, billions of dollars, and the Department of Health role was to push the money into the schools to respond to 9/11 crisis, mental health crisis. And my job was to oversee what was happening in the schools. And I made connections with the schools, and then one of the superintendents at the time, they had superintendents still in New York City, no longer having the school system, said, hey, have you thought of joining the school system? Why not? And I said, well, how much money are you talking? And I'm not coming to DOE unless you pay me more money than I make at the HMH. And unless I could carry over my pension and my vacation days. And they said, yes, the city agency, you carry over your pension and vacation days, and you may get some more time off in the summer, and that was good. And she's going to give me more money, we're going to give you a raise. I said, hey, let's do this. And then I ended up at the DOE, and for a while I was doing some working directly with schools at the DOE in Brooklyn. At that time we had regional offices. And then when the mayor launched his new initiative 2 years ago called the Young Men's Initiative, the deputy chancellor said, hey, do you want to join the team, the citywide initiative? I said, hey, how much money are you talking? I'm not coming unless you pay me more money. And she said, yeah, we're going to pay you more money. And I said, at that time I was already in the union. I said, and am I going to remain in the union? And she said, yeah, you're going to remain in the union. I said, but I'm not leaving the union. And she said, yeah, more money in the union. So there I was. And here I am.
Okay. I think another question that a lot of us have is, what is one of the most important things you took away from your MSW program here at NYU? As students now, what would you tell us to make a focus of our education in terms of furthering our career, especially in the school system? And I mean, in terms of a value or an idea or a class we should focus on that you think would benefit us in a school social work career in the future?
I guess I'll start first. I would say take it all in. Take it all in, because you'll find, especially in the schools, as I had said, is an eclectic approach to school social work. So again, I can't say just human behavior in a social environment, or your classrooms on psychotropic medication. Every class that you take is going to give you a foundation. It's something for you to pull on. I will tell you, however, though, there was one class that stands out for me, and I don't know if they still do it. It was like group dynamics, and you actually were like in a group therapy class, and I hated that class. It was like awful. I don't know why 8 o'clock in the morning they had me in group therapy, but I will tell you, that class, does that class still exist? That you're like in the group therapy, and you write down, and people are talking about what kind of group member you are, and that's like the angry group member. But anyway, I will tell you, that class stands out to me because even for me being a social worker in my career and now being an administrator, it helps me to understand myself in connection and relationship to groups. And when you're working, like I said again, especially in the school system, you're not working in your office. And many times we find that in school social work, you are not working just in your office, you're working within a system. And you need to be able to figure out who you are in that system. And when you're working with groups of folks, what is it that you also give off enough for your voice to be able to be heard? Pay attention to that. And again, as you further develop in your career, you'll get to know that. But that class truly stands out because it helps you to understand and look introspectively as who you are as a professional. Not necessarily school social work per se, but as a professional, really, who are you in relation to others and how you're going to be able to manage the work, if you will.
Well, I feel like at the time, again, as I said, it really wasn't an intention of mine to go into education, but certainly I think the social work education was a great foundation for going into education, and I think universities can really benefit from having social workers in them. I think my experience as psychology is quite settled in the university system, but social work is not as much. The sort of systemic thinking, the policy classes where you, because you're dealing with, creating policy at a university, and even if you're trying to enhance wellness at a university, you don't want to just be working with the individual, you want to look at the whole sort of university environment and the policies and the practices of the university and how they may enhance or detract from the health of a student. I agree that I had a couple group classes, and one in particular, we were in group, and if we chewed gum or went to the bathroom, we were acting out, and it was quite intense, but again,
There's no coffee in that class.
But again, really understanding how to group dynamics is really important in any system, really, not just an education system, but going into a meeting and being able to, manage your own feelings and understand, sort of what some of the group dynamics are and how to most effectively get your message across and work with people and communicate with people. So your group classes, I think, will be helpful. All my clinical skills, I think, are helpful in, you know, certainly in my work when I'm doing therapy, but certainly in negotiating and working as an administrator, just being able to handle, you know, handle and manage, you know, situations and supervising staff and figuring out how to create a functional sort of group environment of workers who are working together and are feeling like they're really excited to be coming to work and feel like the work environment feels like a healthy one. So I think you can't go wrong.
I think for me, you don't want to concentrate or think that you want to concentrate on one particular area and become an expert. None of you are going to be experts when you leave school of social work. Okay, it takes much more to be an expert. So I think you need, as the rest of the panelists said, to get as wide a range of classes under your belt as you can. In fact, it might even be a good idea to take some classes in another school. I took classes at Wagner, I took classes at the School of Education, I even took under a class at the time they had joined, I don't know if they still have the GED program at MSW. So, you know, think about other schools within this university system that you might be able to take a class, an elective class that's going to sort of make your resume look attractive, right? There's a whole lot of social workers out there. There's Columbia and there's you know, Yeshiva and CUNY and LIU just added an MSW program in Brooklyn. So you are not the only one in this pond out here in New York City. On top of that, if you're looking to go into education in New York City, it's a little bit harder because the New York City school system don't hire social workers anymore. We don't hire social workers. Most of our social workers are contracted. They come from the private sector and school principals decided to buy a social worker as a member of their school. You know, we don't have a social work department at New York City. So I think you really want to make yourself attractive out there, to go out there and stand out around, among all the other folks. That's why earlier I was having a conversation with one of your colleagues about where was he placed for his field work. Your field work placement is very important. And you know, a lot of times, at least when I was here, you know, they sort of put you in these places and you're like, why am I even here? And then you get these crappy supervisors who don't have any time for you because they have all this other thing going on. And you're like, oh my God, I'm not learning anything. And then you come and you fight with a few directors. She's like, oh, that's the only place you got, and you got to stay there for the rest of the semester. You're like, I don't want to stay here. I was the type of person that I'm not staying here. You got to find me another place. But where you have your field placement is very important also. So you want to make sure that your field placement lines up with what you think you want to do, but at the same time, you don't want to become too specialized, particularly early on. You would become specialized later on, right, as you grow in the field and in your career, but coming out of the School of Social Work, no one is specialized. So I think you want to be broad. And actually, group was my favorite class. I liked my group class, but we had a really weird group class. She was a psychoanalyst, and she was really old. Yeah. And she was the best.
That was her.
She was the best because she could not use a computer. She would type on little cards and be very like, you got to do it this way, and we would always clash, and that was my best class. So take group work is really good.
All right, well, you were talking a lot about navigating policy in the system, but I have a question about the role the social worker plays in terms of managing the family. Because I imagine any clinical work you do with a student in school involves some sort of dealing with the parents. So what is this role of the social worker in navigating that added relationship?
I mean, I guess, and you'll see that even in many child guidance clinics, they're really looking towards a family approach. I mean, if the family is broken, I could be working with a child in isolation and it's often hard. You know, again, when we work with children and being able to send them back home, we need to make sure that we're also addressing families as well. I think it's very, very interesting, if you don't mind me just for 1 second going back to your point, and just for people who are out there looking for school social work, it's very telling that even in New York, that there's no longer school social work. And one of the things that we talk with folks about, even in the state of Connecticut, is really just like Ainsley, as mentioned, making yourself very, very marketable, because right now you're going to see that the field of school social work will be obsolete if you do not roll up your sleeves and get out there and do any and everything that, again, that the principals want you to do. I'll be quite honest with you. It's a lot cheaper to contract social services or social workers as opposed to folks who are embedded in a part of the school system, which is really, really valuable, as opposed to being a contracted social worker. Being employed by a Board of Education is truly, truly important. But to bridge it with what you're saying, those, again, when you're working with the families, a lot of times for school social workers, and social workers I would think are like, you're dealing a lot with families. You're the one who's making the bridges, not from just families, but also with communities, because families live in communities. So you're also making connections in the community. It's not just, again, when we're looking at the child as an identified client, if you're working in a child guidance clinic, if you will, but in the school system as a student, you're looking at the extension of the family and also the community. And a lot of the work that you're doing really is building relationships. You're building relationships with families. You're trying to understand where they're coming from. You're trying to figure out what is it that's going to be the catalyst for change for this family, for this community, for this child. What little piece within my sphere of influence can I control and contribute to that child being able to have some success? Because one of the things that we are looking at as school social workers, we're removing all of those barriers that impact a child's academic progress and performance. And really, again, when the parents are stressed, impacted, overwhelmed, it impacts the child. It impacts everything that happens within a school community, and you have to see it that way. It's a lot broader. When we're talking about systems, it's a lot broader than just that child. So it may be as a school social worker, you're involved with the PTO. Our school social workers do regional parent workshops, community resource fairs. We do a lot of work. We have what's called in Connecticut, Parent University, where we have parents who are much so involved with a lot of workshops and topics. But I will tell you, again, it's a lot of the relationships that you're building with families and an extension of that within the community, and really trying to figure out what's going to be best to support that child.
I think working with families are very tricky. You have to be careful when you're working with families in schools. You have to remember that you are not a family member. You're on the outside. And families have a way of pulling you in. They're going to pull you into their drama, they're going to pull you into their dysfunction, and before you know it, you are dysfunctional yourself. So I think you need to always be mindful when you work with families, particularly in New York City. If you're going to work in the New York City school system with families, you have to remember a lot of times that you are not the first social worker this child or family has seen. In fact, in New York City, there's now talk that a lot of families who see social workers have something called social service equity. They have seen so many of us in their lifetime that we are just another face. They have seen us in the clinics, they have seen us from government services, they have seen us in the school system. Their son has seen us because he's been suspended, or their daughter has seen us because they're in the clinic for their attention deficit. They have seen tons of social workers. And many times, we are just another social worker. So as my colleague up here said, you just have to sort of figure out why you're there, what is the little piece you could fix, and when you need to move out. You know, you have to be very careful when working with families, particularly in urban settings, in large cities, where families who see social workers, chances are they are seeing social workers more than once, and will continue to see them again. And their grandparents and siblings and family members have seen social workers themselves. So, you know, you need to be very careful. And I think if you're working with families, you need to be in some treatment yourself. I'm serious. When I worked at Staten Island Mental Health Society, I was in treatment. I went to treatment 2 days a week. I had my own private I'm a fan of psychoanalytic treatment, so I have my own private analyst in Walton Hill, and on Mondays and Wednesdays I went there at 7:30 in the morning, and I sat on her couch and we talked about, you know, and she thought I had some issues myself in my family, but we talked about what was going on in the clinic, and I used that, because if you don't have that, you're going to burn out. These families are very dysfunctional. Families that are in treatment and families that see social workers, they're there for a reason. They are dysfunctional. And they're going to pull you into it if they could. And that's what they do. Not intentionally, not consciously. So, you know, it happens unconsciously. And they pull you into their system and you get caught up. So I think you should think about those of you who are not in treatment. Think about entering treatment. There's a lot of free clinics and you can get reduced treatment in New York City.
I agree. Treatment's a good idea. I did want to say that, Ainsley, you mentioned before just the previous question about internships. I do think they can be important. I had great internships, and they weren't in education, but certainly when I'm getting resumes for people who want to work at the university, if I see that they have had experience, that is very, you know, it's attractive, it's relevant, it's a good thing because it is competitive out there. So I would say if you know already that you have an interest in education, I would try to talk with someone here at NYU and get placed. And then it also may open up a job opportunity. Sometimes, you know, you'll spend a year at some place and they love you and you love them, and a job could come out of it. I mean, that happened to me. My second year placement became a job for a few years for me, and that was a great experience. So that's just a suggestion, and I think the internships can be really important. In terms of families, I'm working at a university, so theoretically, I'm working with people who are 18 and over, and there are privacy laws at universities. But I'll tell you, when I was going to college, when you went to college, I mean, first of all, I talked to my family maybe once a week on a payphone in the hallway. And so you have students now, you know, all of us are walking around, most of us with smartphones, and are in, you know, constant touch with the people in our lives. We have students who are being, the parents, you know, when I went to college, I knew how to do my own laundry, I knew how to cook. My parents didn't they weren't expected or imagined they would be involved in what was going on in my college education, and now the students that I'm seeing are very different. There's a lot more expectation that the parents are going to be more involved when something happens, rather than the student sometimes directly dealing with it. You might actually have a parent calling, and that will go on even for some of our graduate students. So we do have some family involvement. A lot of times we do have to say to the parent that your son or daughter is over 18, and actually we cannot really talk to you about this unless your son or daughter gives us permission. That being said, in the mental health clinic at the university, sometimes students are having very serious, you know, issues going on, may end up in the hospital, may end up having a serious medical condition. And so we are seeing that families are getting involved. Obviously, a family is still an important support system for students, even though they are adults. And so many times we are, mostly with the permission of the student, occasionally we have to do it otherwise, getting families involved, coming into town if they don't live nearby, and getting involved with helping support the student and figuring out, do they need to go home? Are they going to stay? What supports do they need? How can the family get involved? Some of our international students actually occasionally have family members that actually move here to live with their son or daughter, or it might be a niece or nephew, to actually support them and be here for them while they're here in college. So there is some family involvement, but not as relevant in the university.
Can I say one other thing regarding And I stepped out for a second, so Ainsley, I think you started to talk about this, but I think one of the things that we have to be mindful, and Ainsley was talking about really that many of our families have seen a social worker, good, bad, and indifferent, and have that experience. But one of the things that I find sometimes is that we pathologize families and then enforce our agenda, and then feel that we are going to single-handedly help families pull themselves up by the bootstraps. I think it's a very bad mistake. I think that when we enforce and that we are the know-alls and the be-alls and end-alls, and we enforce that on a family, again, when I talk about the, especially in large urban districts, when we talk about the relationships, you do that and it's really going to impede any kind of progress that you would make with that family, because the trust has already been broken, because you've already imposed your agenda on somebody else. And I think we have to be very, very mindful of that and be very culturally responsive to families, and making sure that we understand some of their own family systems before we're putting, sometimes very early on. I know I used to do it very early on in my career. I said, you know, I'm going to have these sessions with the families and the children, and in this session I'm going to get through all of this in my agenda, and it doesn't work that way. And you learn that as you are out in the field, but I know that you know, can be a turnoff when we say that we're going to empower families. Again, many of them already come with many, many circumstances, and it just needs some guidance. Many of them, if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, many of our families, especially in a large urban district in which I work in, basic needs aren't met. So social work may just be, guess what, let me try to figure out how I can connect you to get these needs met. And then all of the other circumstances in a family or some of the other stressors are sometimes alleviated. So just be mindful of that and not imposing your own agenda on a family, which I think will significantly impact the relationship with them.
Now, when you first came in earlier, you were discussing how important it is for the social worker to do more than just focus on the individual student and really work to impact the greater system. Mm-hmm. And in terms of your day-to-day job, what you do when you walk in the door, mm-hmm. what does that mean to address policy and influence the system? How do you go about doing that?
Right now, because I'm a director of, I was a school social worker, I was a clinical social worker, I was a school social worker, then I was a supervisor of social workers in special ed, now I'm the director. So I have an opportunity to influence the supervisor of social work, who now influences the actual social workers by way of their practice. And I'll tell you, when I first came in for my job, the superintendent came out clearly and said to me, I don't know what social workers do, I don't know what they are. I don't know what school social workers do, and that let me know right off the bat that there was an issue of value and visibility. And that meant that the principals weren't talking a lot about what school social workers were doing. There were still some school social workers who were so much so they isolated that they worked in their office. Again, they worked with kids who were mandated by way of an IEP, and that's who was on their counseling caseload, and kids who were in crisis. They'd have the kid come into the social work office, and that's all they did. The kid would be in the social work office, you know, learning and working on whatever skills. The kids could not generalize those skills into the classroom, and it was this cycle going back and forth. And one of the things that you would hear constantly from principals is, well, what does that person do? I don't even know who that person is. I know that the only thing I know is that we used to have a reputation, quite honestly, in our district that all the social workers, all they did was see mandated kids, and the kids who, you know, kids who were identified by as needing special education services, who were mandated to have counseling supports. We have worked, and we're talking about policy and system change, we have worked diligently and very, very hard to make sure that social workers are equipped with skills in scientifically research-based interventions. That's RTI nationally. In Connecticut, we call it scientifically research-based interventions, so that they can work preventatively outside of just the kids who are on their caseloads. That they're adding more values to the building, because now they're working in, whether it's they're doing bullying campaigns, whether it's now you have a social worker who's on what we call a student support teams, and they're helping to build systems within their own schools enough to be able to make change. We do that from a central office. It's kind of a top down and a bottom up, and really getting feedback and equipping people with the skills, because it's a comfort level. Not everyone is comfortable as a school social worker standing with a teacher and doing curriculum. We actually now, again, if we're looking at this by way of prevention, we're looking at actually infusing curriculum with social workers aligned with teachers and teaching pro-social skills. That was something that we didn't do before. And that had to do with certain social workers did it because they had a level of comfort, and there was others who really again, came from a strictly clinical world. I know the DSM, I know the psychotropic medications that the child is on. I know when the doctor said this, and now I have my individual counseling sessions within the school. It's not a child guidance clinic. School social work is not a child guidance clinic. And I will tell you that if we're down that path, you're going to see things that are happening in some places in Connecticut. School social work is obsolete. Just as Ainsley is talking about, where there's contractual folks, and good, bad, and indifferent. There's not, there's different schools of thought about it. But again, it's value that you add once you are actually absolutely able to impact systems. So we do that, again, quite honestly, in a number of ways, in really talking, equipping people with the skills enough to be comfortable to make that kind of systemic change, and then making sure that we continue to work on that. Our school social workers have what we call data teams, where they're analyzing behavioral data. We're doing the same kind of things. We're working in a school. How do you know that, again, when you're giving counseling sessions after 8 weeks, by way of the insurance companies, you can put down, oh, the kid is going to make 10% growth in X, Y, and Z, but how do you actually know? What evidence do you have to suggest or to support the fact that there's been any growth? We actually have social workers that are doing that now. They're looking at data the same way. Teachers are looking at academic data. We have social workers who are looking at behavioral data and working in concert. So it's been slow, but I think that, again, we're looking at visibility and value that social workers are adding to buildings. So
I think for New York City, you won't be influencing any policy. That's for sure. Policy is made out of City Hall. We have a school system run by a mayor of New York City, and policy is made in the central office. We have either. But if you're working in the schools, you are not making any policy. You're doing direct services. You're following whatever the principal says you're going to do. And the principal runs his or her building. Once you get up to the level where I am at the central office, and you begin to interact with the chancellor of the school system, or the deputy chancellor, or the mayor, folks at City Hall, you may have some influence on policy and policy formation and articulating policy, but it still all stems from what the mayor wants. If this is what he wants, this is what he gets. So, for example, I am the education point person for the city around the Young Men's Initiative, and he said, hey, this is what I want, and you all go out there and get it done. And you can make the policy, but within the confines of what I want, and we have particular goals. But I do think for social workers, you should take your policy class, which I know you still have SWAT. SWAT 1 and SWAT 2. Who you have? So you want to take your policy class, but you want to also take some advanced policy classes too, because everything that you do stems out of policy. Social work doesn't just happen like that, particularly in New York City, in an urban district. It all flows from advocacy, and then comes the laws, and then the money and the trickle down. So you want to have a sense of where some of this is coming from. And again, back to what the panel said, you always want to be smarter than the next guy. You want to know something that the next guy don't know next to you. New York City is the most competitive city in the world, right? And even in social work, we compete. So you don't want to be out there and not knowing something. And if you have the next mayor, like the current mayor, you want to always be able to outshine the guy sitting next to you. That's the only way you're going to move up and make the 6 figures and sit next to the chancellor. You got to outshine the next guy. So you want to have a sense of policy, even though you may not be making policy. You want to get a sense of where these things come from. But at my stage, there are very few people who make policy in the DOE. As I said, it comes out of City Hall, and I do have the ability to make some policy, but again, my guidance is through the mayor.
On this little list of questions that they gave me, one of them is, what's one of the most surprising things about your work? And I'd like to add to that, could you also identify one of the most negative or maybe challenging aspects of your job? And what's one of the most positive and rewarding things, if you have any thoughts on that?
I think one of the most challenging, I think, is what Ainsley is talking about, is really the politics of the job. I mean, especially when you become an administrator in a central office, if you will, Board of Education. There's a lot of politics that oftentimes influence things. that sometimes can be stifling and sometimes frustrating, especially if you can't figure out how to break through them. I think it goes back, like I said again, and really having some level of perseverance and figuring out what's the best way to get your voice heard. It's challenging, but I think that, again, it takes a lot of perseverance to get through it. I think one of the most rewarding things in my job is almost the opposite of that, is I'm able to have a voice from many, many folks in my district that, again, is very, very valuable because it impacts 20,000 plus kids that are at the end within our particular school district. So I think that what's most rewarding, even though we're not necessarily connected directly with students in the way that I sometimes would like, I think it's really nice that you are actually at the table to make decisions that impact many students and families. So that's rewarding when you see some of those things happening. And again, the challenge about some of the administrative bureaucracy is sometimes challenging in my job anyway.
Well, there's one of the things that's really exciting about working at a university is that working with the students. And certainly it's wonderful to do clinical work with the students. They're a really fun group. They're really excited. Just like you, they're pursuing dreams and in a place in their lives where lots is happening, lots changing, very open to a lot of ideas, a lot of intellectual sort of stimulation and curiosity. So they're a great group to work with in college and graduate school. In terms of policy, what's really fun and exciting for me at the university is being able to work with students and for them to have a voice in policy development. And that as a social worker and as someone who really likes to see all the key stakeholders come to the table and really have a voice in developing policy, and that I'm in a position where I have enough power at my university to bring people together and bring students in to have a voice. And, you know, like recently, well, a couple of years ago, we created a new sexual assault policy. There are a lot of students who had a lot of ideas and feelings and passion about, you know, preventing sexual violence and addressing sexual violence when it occurred. So we brought them to the table and started asking them what did they want to see in the policy. I got to do research about what are best practices across the country in terms of sexual assault policies. We got to hear from the lawyers at the university about what they needed to see in a sexual assault policy. We got to have administrators at the table too. And then we began drafting a new policy. And I'd say, you know, experiences like that are really wonderful because you know that the people that it's directly impacting are having a voice in it. It feels wonderful to have influence on something that's going to really sort of impact the entire environment and not just one person. And for me, specifically with that particular project, it was wonderful because of my background in working with a lot of survivors of violence. You know, I could bring that knowledge base to the table as well. I've been fortunate enough to be able to be involved in administrative tasks like that, and also when there's a crisis going on with a student, I could be at the table and really talking about how to manage a mental health or medical crisis. And every once in a while, I get to see a student and do therapy with a student. So for me, the wide range of skills that I can use at the university has been really wonderful. I would say politics, again, I would agree with my panelists here, that fellow panelists, that politics can be difficult. And, you know, sometimes decisions aren't always made because it's the right and the good decision. Sometimes there are a lot of competing factors. Factors like liability, you know, risk management, how administrators view it. What do the board of trustees think? What do students think? What do I think? And so I guess I would agree that being persevering and being patient, because sometimes you want to see the right thing happen right away, but sometimes it takes time, and you have to hang in there, and over time things do change. And sometimes influencing the conversation takes a while. Sometimes things happen that you're not, that you're not really happy to be involved with. Decisions are made and you don't feel like they're the right decision, and that can be difficult. So that's probably the least agreeable part of my job, is when something happens that I don't feel happy about, or I don't think was the right decision, and I have to. It's just part of the work.
I think for me, New York City, of course, is the largest school system in this country, the world, 1.1 million kids for the school in New York City public schools. I think for me, it's how large the system is that, it's very hard to make an impact such a large system, right? And continue to grow. So you sort of have to decide, hey, this is as much as I can do and do it well, and at times you want to change the large system, and you can. So that's sort of sometimes frustrating. So you have to sort of always be mindful of that. But the good piece of it is I try to get into the schools as much as possible. So I go to the school maybe twice every week. I go to the school. So I'm always interacting with the kids and interacting with the principals and hanging out in the classroom and talking to the kids and sort of seeing what's happening and how things are going. So that's the fun part, that I get to be in the central office and do policy stuff and work, with the deputy chancellors and the chancellors in City Hall. And we have a great dynamic, mayor who's very progressive thinking and creative thinking, the way he look at education policy and the way he look at achievement in the city. So it's a good time to work in city government and to go from the City Hall. But then twice a week I get to meet the schools and sort of hang out with the kids. I'm like, this is fun, I didn't know this. And they're like, hey, you're pretty cool. I'm like, yeah, I am. So, I have fun, and then I come back to my office and I realize, okay, so this is why we do what we do. That it's all about those kids. That at the end of the day, everything that we do in the school system is to ensure that they are achieving and we're
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I thought it would be nice to open the floor to questions that some of you might have. Yes.
In terms of, I don't know when you first started, I am interested in becoming an LCSW, but so I've been told that acquiring hours that go towards that, some school jobs allow for that, some don't. Do you have anything about that?
In the state of Connecticut, the hours that you work would be counted, and the challenge is finding a supervisor, because most of the school social workers do not have the opportunity at a time where, if you're in a private sector, of being able to have the 1 hour a week of clinical work. Understand that school social work is not necessarily clinical work, so it's very challenging to find that, but the hours are counted in the state of Connecticut. But yeah, it's just about really finding the clinical experience and the supervisor.
And in New York City, it's going to be the same. You're going to have to ensure that the work that you're doing in the city, if you get to do work in the city, is clinical based, right? Because a lot of the work is going to be around psycho-ed work, which sometimes doesn't count as clinical hours, right? Because we do a lot of psycho-ed work. So you may actually want to look at a part-time clinical job that you develop your clinical hours. If the school system pays well, right? It pays well with security, with pension, benefits and all that, health insurance, so you're good, you're set. But you may want to look at doing some work in a clinic after hours to build up your hours towards your LCSW if you're staying in New York City.
I saw over here.
So I was a New York City public school teacher, and the school that I was at was huge, and we had...
What school was it?
PS 86.
Okay.
And so we had a couple social workers that were hired by the principal that sort of did like the kids that were mandated and some at-risk counseling. And then we had a couple social workers who were doing like school-based support team stuff, so they were like observing kids and then doing IEP meetings and stuff like that. And I never quite understood, and it sounds like you're saying stuff has changed in terms of, but I didn't understand like the possible roles that New York City has available for social workers in schools right now.
So if you want to work directly with the city as a city employee in terms of school social work, it would be part of that school-based support team, the folks that will observing the kids and doing the child study and doing the the whole behavioral piece around the IEPs and specialized services. So that would be the most secure way to get it. Now, schools, as you figured out, the principal decided to hire some social workers out of her own budget. However, it means that if next year her budget is cut, she's going to let go of the social workers. And that always happens. So a principal hiring social workers out of her own budget is a luxury. So that school, maybe it was a Title I school, and it was a large school, she got a lot of extra dollars, and she said, hey, I want to hire some social workers. But if next year her budget cut, they most likely will go. So that's sort of what happened. The best way to get in now is through the school-based support team. And very few social workers leave the school system. They die at their desks. They don't want to leave there. They die there. They get the summer off.
Vacations.
At 25,
Salary.
25 you could be making six figures. If you are 25 years in a job, you could clock out at $105,000, which is enormous amount of money for a social worker, right? And you have all these great benefits of pension plan, and who's leaving that? So they just hang out there.
So, but are they like hired by the city and then sent to the school, or does?
Yeah, so they go through. So they would be hired through our central office, which is at Court Street. So at 65 Court Street is our HR department, and that's all the hiring. And you could go there and actually see that they're open. Or you could go on our website, and we have a very robust website that has all the openings. But again, if you see a social work job up on there, it's few and far.
However, if you'd like to cross the line, you won't be stuck with doing, especially if you come to New Haven, you will not just be doing IEP meetings because we don't want to do that. It limits you, quite honestly. It would be nice if that same social worker who's hired by the principal could do that and the other kinds of stuff, because to be honest with you, even though Director of Student Services, I'm also the Director of Special Ed, if you will, can't just do that. Work in isolation, and I'll be honest with you, it's much better work, because a lot of kids, if you can prevent them, especially from some of the social emotional behavior challenges, they're not going to be identified. So in the state of Connecticut, most of the time it's hired by the city and then being able to go into the school. So it's a very, very secure job, but it's a little bit broader as far as what school social workers will do.
Okay, so we're close to the end, so I think we'll take one last question.
This is sort of a logistical question about becoming a social worker in New York City. There's an additional, besides the MSW, an additional certification that you need.
Yes. So you're going to have to do some stuff around, child abuse and neglect stuff, right? There's another training, a 5-hour training that you go through around domestic violence, and I think there's one other. So other than getting an MSW, or your LCSW, which is the state, you actually become certified to be a school social worker, right? And it's in alignment with what you do in school. It's just some additional workshop classes you go to, and then you take the test, and mostly you pass the test,
And where do we find out about that? Is online?
So we have the DOE website, you have the DOE website, the HR, there's a whole HR link, and then there's HR Connect, which is a phone number you could call. But most people visit 65 Court Street. Most people go downtown to downtown Brooklyn and go to 65 Court Street, and they have upcoming postings around social work and stuff. But the best way is the way that your student did it. By getting into a school, and everyone talked about it, getting a field placement in the school and really making yourself indispensable to the principal, that's all the principal decide, hey, I want a social worker in my school. And then they decide to hire you, and then there's a way you can actually get on to a permanent line. So they're running the school. That's the easiest and best way to do it. Another way is a lot of time contracted social workers come in through private agencies, so they may come into a CBO, and principals say, I like this social worker, and have a private conversation. I want to take you, do you want to join my school? And it happens that way. So you may come in, let's say you're working with a leadership program, or you're working with Settlement House, something like that in the school, because most of these schools have agencies like that working in there, and then the principal realizes, I want you on my team, and bring you on. What happens then? It's all about connections.
The social workers in my daughter's school in New York City are called guidance counselors. Is that, I mean,
So that's just internal.
just in names,
Yeah.
but they do a lot of like, they're in elementary school, so they're helping all these kids get into middle school.
Right, so they do a lot of articulation, a lot of middle school articulation, which means that that school, either she may not have a true guidance counselor, because keep in mind that the law doesn't say that the elementary school have to have a guidance counselor. The New York State Ed law says that high schools must have guidance counselors, right, schools with one credit, and middle schools must have at least one guidance counselor, true guidance counselor, to work with middle school kids who are going to high school. But a principal of an elementary school does not have to have a guidance counselor. So a smart principal, like your daughter's principal, would say, I can hire a social worker who could provide me social work services, crisis intervention that I may need at time, some group work for kids who are acting on time, but also train her to do the middle school application process, because she doesn't have to have a guidance counselor. So she gets 2 for 1. That's a smart principal. What's good with that? Yeah, so she's a smart principal.
Okay, so it looks like we're out of time for tonight, although if you have extra questions, please come up and present them. But I'd like to thank all of you for coming and participating as well as our